Paladin's Quest, Weight of the World, or Linus, Memories of the Ancient Machine, by Hexatona. Rating, Teen. Summary. When Chesney, a young spiritualist, activates an ancient and terrible machine, he unknowingly sets the world on a course to absolute destruction. Now, he's on a race against the clock to stop what he has started, but can he ever make up for the lives his actions have cost? Full novelization of the game Paladin's Quest for the Super Nintendo, also known as Linus in Japan.
The story of Linus is 10,000 years old. An unprecedented tragedy is about to take place.
Chapter 1. Chesney gasped and sat bolt upright in bed. His night clothes were sticky with sweat. It was another nightmare. It didn't happen often, but it was always the same. Darkness, and drowning. Thunder, and roaring. He had never understood where the nightmare came from, but that didn't stop them from coming. Once he had caught his breath, he looked at the amount of light coming from the dorm window and figured it was shortly after dawn. The other boys were all still sleeping. Not wanting to wake them, Chesney decided he might as well get up and get studying for the test that was coming up today. He wasn't getting back to sleep, that was for sure. Being as silent as possible, he changed out of his night clothes, splashed some water on his face at the basin, and looked in the mirror. His blonde hair was looking particularly unruly, so he pulled the mess into a ponytail and called it a day. This will have to do, he thought. He wasn't in the mood to properly get cleaned up. As he quietly tiptoed out of the dorm and began to walk the empty halls of the magic school, he was reminded of just how much had changed in his life in just 1 year. It had taken him a few months to feel comfortable here at the magic school. Being raised in the fishing village where he grew up was really all he had ever imagined his life was going to be, until that one day. But then they found out he had talent as a spiritualist, and they shipped him off to train his talent. Apparently, this was the best magic school on Linus. Then what the heck do they even teach at the other ones? He mused. He seemed to learn more about history than about magic, to his chagrin. So much theory, not enough practice. He wanted to do more, learn everything about magic. Once he had gotten over the shock of no longer growing up to be a fisherman, he very quickly discovered he wanted very desperately to be a great spiritualist, like Great Gabnid, or Cormu, or Sophie. He wanted to master every element, and find new ways to use them. But, instead, I have to study for my history exam. Sighing, he plopped down into a chair in the deserted library and cracked open Nasquat and Sasquat, A History of Linus, by Grezin, and got to reading. It was only a short time later that some of the other boys began to trickle in, and some of the girls from the dorm across the hall as well. Samza, a Laffery girl, walked in with her friends. She glanced at Chesney and smiled, before sitting down elsewhere. Chesney suddenly realized he'd been reading the same paragraph about 3 times, and felt a bit self-conscious about not cleaning up as best he could this morning. She was beautiful, tall, had the most mesmerizing shade of pink hair, and gray eyes like a storm coming from the ocean. Of course, Chesney had hardly exchanged a few words with her since he arrived at school, but a boy can dream. Right on time. That's just when his best friend Tail hopped into the seat beside him and gave him an eye waggle.
I think someone has a crush,
he teased.
Who knows, maybe she digs the small eyebrows? Shut up, they'll grow eventually,
Chesney whispered harshly, punching his friend in the arm. Geez, you sure know how to make a guy feel special, buddy, he thought to himself. Chesney, Tail, Samza, and almost all the students at the magic school were Laffery, with a few notable exceptions. Linus had many races. The Laffery just happened to be a race often gifted with spiritual powers. They had pale pinkish skin, pointed ears that grew larger over time, and their eyebrows grew very long, almost like antennae, and sometimes even split up into pairs. Over the last year, Chesney had been made very aware that Tail's sea-green hair and perfect eyebrows were apparently Very in, judging by the cooing girls and giggles as he'd walk past. Chesney, not so much. His eyebrows grew off a bit, but it was barely noticeable. Chesney couldn't feel mad, though. Tail had been the first one to reach out to him when he first arrived at the school. He had been sitting alone at lunch, when Tail had surreptitiously sat in front of him and started a ridiculous impression of the headmaster that involved 2 dinner rolls stuffed into his cheeks. Chesney laughed so hard that milk shot out of his nose and completely covered Tail, and they both fell into a fit of laughter, and very shortly, they shared attention. They had been inseparable ever since.
"All right, lover boy, you gotta help me study for this test,"
Tail asked, leaning in.
"When I try reading that stuff, my brain turns into goobo dung. But when you explain it, it makes perfect sense. Please?"
He whined. Chesney groaned. Every time, every test, Tail was there begging for a mini-lecture. There was no getting out of it, though. He tried to absolutely refuse once, but Tail got so desperate that there was not a single moment Chesney had to himself for all of his whining.
"Fine,"
he said, sighing loudly and with obvious resignation.
"What do you need to know?" "Okay, so, I get that there are the 2 big continents, Nasquat and Sasquat, and the magic school here is basically as north in Nasquat as you can get. But I am totally spacing on all the races, and where they each are. So, the whole lesson, then."
Chesney growled through gritted teeth.
"Glad we're on the same page,"
Tail replied, grinning like a fool. Chesney desperately wanted to give him all the wrong information as a lesson on being so lazy, but, like always, he couldn't bring himself to do it.
"All right,"
he began.
"In Nasquat, the northern continent, are 5 races. Us, the Lafri, the Skuru, a race of flying nomad, the Sainal, an aquatic race that can also live on land, the Good, those big bushmen types from Ratsir, and lastly the Godum, a primarily underground race of miners with tough armored skin. All coming back to you?"
Tail nodded along.
Right. I forgot about the Sainal. Say, that Duke kid is Sainal, right?"
Chesney nodded.
"Yep."
Tail lowered his voice to a whisper, and said,
"Man, you gotta watch out for that guy. I hear he's got it out for you." "Me? Why?"
Chesney asked, scrunching up his face a bit. He didn't much like Duke, ever since he arrived a few weeks back. Always had something snarky to say intended to interrupt lectures.
"'Cause, man, you're the special kid, the only one who can use fire spirit. I'm hardly a prodigy, Tail. I can use fire, and yeah, that's about it." "Whoa, that reminds me. Did you hear about that famous spiritualist prodigy in Ratsirk, Midia?"
Tail said, almost shouting in excitement.
"In Ratsirk? Really? That town nearby with all the goobo herding good? Why would a spiritualist like that be in Ratsirk, of all places?" "Well, I don't know, but I heard that the headmaster heads over every week to get lessons."
Chesney looked down and thought. While it wasn't unheard of, a good with the gift of being a spiritualist was totally possible, but for one to be some kind of prodigy was definitely a surprise. He had some questions.
"Do you know anything else about this Midia?" "Just that apparently she's only 13.
Tail said at last.
"Our age? Well, if that's true, why isn't she enrolled here?"
Now it was Tail's turn to get lost in thought.
"You know, now that you mention it, that is weird. I think someone is pulling your leg, Tail,"
Chesney said, lightly chiding his friend.
"But it would explain why the headmaster was leaving the school every week all mysterious-like. I think you're just an incorrigible gossip, Bud.
Tail gave him a goofy sneer and stuck out his tongue, before his expression changed and he burst out.
"Wait, I forgot about Sasquat. What are the Sasquat races?"
"He's all over the place. Geez."
Good question,"
Chesney said, flipping open his book and running his finger over the pages.
"I'm not the best at this either. One sec. Blah, blah, blah. antagonistic relationship to Nasquat, joined by a gondola network over the ocean. Blah blah. Oh, here we go. Okay. So, there's the Fiorla, the Alorn, the Shimrick, the Doru, and the Rakorn.
Tail, furiously scribbling notes on a napkin, asked without looking up.
Okay, and what are they like?
Chesney read out loud from the book.
Quick summaries. Fiorla are like Lafri, only with scaly head armor. Alorn are dragony reptile things. Shimrick are aquatic and good warriors. Doru are also a lot like the Lafri and Fiorla, and butt heads with them a lot. And the Rakorn are a lot like the Gotham, apparently. Buddy, you're a lifesaver.
Tail crowed.
I'm gonna ace. Wait. No. Let's be real here. I'm gonna do okay on that test.
Together they laughed, closed up their books, and went off to have something to eat before class started. Chesney couldn't help but notice when he looked back that Samza was definitely watching him leave, and he got a strange fluttery feeling in his insides that didn't go away for a long time.
That's all for today's classes, everyone. Don't forget your homework.
Their teacher, Ms. Rosso, chimed out after lessons. The day started with the exam, and there was a bit more on the test than Chesney had expected. Beyond the races of Lennis, there was also questions on all the different spirits one could learn to control as a spiritualist. Chesney was ashamed of how badly he had studied for that part of the exam, but he had done the best he could. He looked over at the grumbling and gloomy Tail next to him and was thankful that he at least did better than his friend. As was tradition, everyone gathered together into little groups to gossip about how they had done on the test, who they thought must have passed or failed, and asking,
"What did you say for this question?"
Just as he began packing up, Chesney noticed a sour face on Tail, looked up, and noticed that the diminutive sailboy Duke was walking up to them with a few of their classmates. Duke seemed even younger than everyone, but he swore he was 13 like the rest of them. Like all Sainal, his ears were very long and thin and pointed, and actually began much lower down the jaw, closer to the chin than where Lafri ears grew. His hair was a reddish-pink color, and along his back were 2 long fins, pink and light blue. He wore a smirk on his face that never seemed to leave it.
You know, Chesney, I heard you have some kind of natural gift to fire magic, but even if that's true, you're nothing special,
he said, crossing his arms in front of him and looking right at Chesney. The other classmates could sense something was brewing and started to wander over too.
Nice to see you too, Duke,
Chesney drawled in reply.
I want to see what you're made of. Right. You all want to see too, right?
Duke asked, looking around, trying to egg the crowd on. There was some light nodding.
Oh really? And what exactly are you proposing, Duchess?
Tail replied from his seat nearby.
It's Duke, you fool.
Duke spluttered, clearly caught off guard. But he quickly regained his footing by looking at Chesney and said,
I double dare you to climb up the Tower of Gabnid.
A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The dreaded double dare. The nuclear weapon of dares, someone said.
That's always supposed to be locked up and off-limit, though.
Another person said,
Oh, I heard there's a super cool treasure in there. I want to see it. That's a really stupid idea, Duke,
Chesney said, shaking his head exasperatedly.
Not only is it locked, but if I got caught, I'd be in detention forever. Ah, is somebody a scared little gobbo cup?
Duke said, in a mocking baby voice.
I have the key right here, chump. No weaseling out of this one.
That got Chesney mad. Nobody called him a chicken. But even he wasn't stupid enough to agree to this.
Listen, Duke, there's no way I'm going up there,
he began, but then he happened to look right at Samza and his brain turned right off. He suddenly felt this desperate need to do something, anything to impress her.
You up there without you.
Another collective gasp from the group. Even Samza seemed surprised, and Tail had an absolutely gobsmacked look on his face.
Yeah, how do I know you won't just rat me out as soon as I get in there? So, if I'm going, you're going. You got a problem with that?
Chesney said, nodding his head and crossing his arms. Rather than back down at all, Duke got a fierce look in his eyes and said,
Finally, some guts. I'll meet you at the Tower of Gabnid. Make sure you're right there, chump,
before dashing out of the room. Now that he had a second to think things through, Chesney wasn't so sure he made the right call, but there was no backing out now, and nobody called him a whittle goobo cub. After Duke left, Samsa and Tail walked over to him with concern on their faces.
Are you sure about this, Chesney? You don't have to prove anything,
Samsa said. Chesney sighed.
I know, but it's just... I feel like it's something I have to do.
He scratched the back of his head.
I don't suppose you guys know anything about the tower?
The Tower of Gabnid was an enormous structure within the walls of the magic school. The base of it was a colorful metal exterior that almost looked like a part of the magic school, with some kind of weird door with no handle in front. South of it was a strange collection of very small buildings that looked like sheds, surrounding some kind of glyph that looked like a droplet of water. But the most amazing thing about the Tower of Gabnid was what extended from the main building. A massive, crystalline metal structure rising high into the sky. The bottom was rounded, and above it was a dizzying pattern of rays and trails and zigs and zags that almost made it look like a comet that had been frozen in time and suspended just above the ground. Chesney, and every other student at the magic school, loved to come up with stories and theories around what the tower was. It was the biggest mystery at school.
Well,
Samsa began, looking thoughtful.
According to this book I read, it said that the Tower of Gabnid was created 10,000 years ago by the great first spiritualist, Gabnid. He was one of the three that brought magic to Lennis. Some even say he was the person to bring magic to Lennis. So you're saying,
Tail began,
if there's going to be some super cool thing that teaches people never before seen spiritualist secrets, it will be in there?
Samsa's face turned disapproving.
I suppose. But Tail, I can't believe you're encouraging this. I wouldn't say I'm encouraging this, per se, but I sure would like to see Duke have to shut up for once,
he replied. Samsa giggled just a little.
Yes, I suppose that would be nice for a change.
She looked at Chesney sincerely.
But be careful, okay? Don't do anything dangerous.
Trying to hide his blush with a laugh, Chesney replied.
And no sweat. I promise. Samsa.
Over her shoulder, he caught Tail looking at him with a definite eyebrow waggle. Suppressing the urge to strangle his friend, Chesney quickly made his goodbyes and dragged Tail out of the classroom. After that, Chesney decided he wanted to be alone for a little while to think. The Tower of Gabnid had always intrigued him, of course. What was such a huge structure like that doing at a magic school? If it was part of the facilities, why was it always locked, and nobody could enter? Was it just a secret from the students? His wandering feet found him coming back to the dorm, which was totally empty save for the two attendants, Lilouette and Luliette. They were Laffery sisters and could often be heard bickering about one thing or another when they thought nobody could hear. Lilouette, with dark purple hair, was the one in charge of meals and keeping the beds and facilities in good repair. If she found out you weren't taking the proper care and respect of the magic school's property, you would get an earful. Luliette, with bright red hair, was something akin to the school nurse. She made sure people got proper rest, treated injuries, and made sure the students were always prepared for emergencies. She made sure every single student knew basic first aid, and to keep supplies handy at all times. From time to time, he liked to talk to them when he couldn't really talk to anyone else. They always listened and seemed to have good advice. As Chesney walked past, Luliette called out to him.
Goodness, Chesney, you certainly look lost in thought. Anything the matter?
Chesney was caught a little off guard, so while he wanted to make up a convincing lie about what he was thinking about, most of the truth came out instead.
Oh, hi. I was just thinking about the tower.
Dang it. Why did I say that?
Oh.
Lilouette, the other sister asked, tilting her head.
What about it? Oh, just, wondering what's in it. And stuff.
Chesney said, laughing half-heartedly, trying to mask his discomfort with the line of questioning. The two sisters looked at each other a moment and shrugged.
I don't think anyone's ever really mentioned it. Yeah, I can't think of anything.
Lilouette began, putting his finger to her chin in thought. Her expression changed to something like surprise, and she said,
Oh wait, I think I remember some gossip about it. Some kind of big secret is locked up in there, maybe? All I know is that none of the staff, even the headmaster, is allowed in. Huh, so not even you guys are allowed in. Interesting,
he said, thinking deeply. What could the tower possibly be there for, then, if not even the headmaster goes in?
Nope, sorry, hun,
Lilouette said. She looked at Chesney for a moment with an unreadable expression on her face, then reached down under the counter and brought up a bottle.
You know what this is and how to use it, right?
Chesney nodded.
Sure, it's a medicine bottle. Why?
She slid it over to him.
I want you to take it. The medicine in there will cure wounds and fatigue really quickly, and if you ever run out, I can fill it back up for you.
Puzzled, Chesney picked it up and asked,
Well, okay, but why?
The two sisters looked at each other, shrugged, and said in unison,
Just a feeling.
There wasn't much else to say after that. Chesney was a little weirded out by the encounter, but he had to admit having the bottle of the fast-acting medicine that she used on hand was an incredibly valuable tool, especially for a spiritualist. Chesney's curiosity was in overdrive, thinking on what secret could be locked away in there. So he had looked around for someone else to ask, as surreptitiously as possible, of course, about the tower, when he ran into the headmaster in the hall, just coming out of his office. Headmaster Dacant was a truly ancient-looking Laffery. His hair was gray, and he was also quite fat.
Hello, Headmaster,
Chesney began, politely.
Oh, Chesney, I hardly saw you there,
he began, a kind smile on his face.
Did you need something?
Chesney was about to reply when the headmaster immediately continued.
Sorry, it will have to wait. I have some, business to attend to in the neighboring town of Ratzurk.
Ratzurk? Chesney thought. Maybe that rumor about the prodigy spiritualist was right. Chesney could hardly form a goodbye as the headmaster hurried away down the hall, almost bumping into another set of students. Really nice, but a total scatterbrain. With nothing left for it, he began to leave the magic school as well. He wanted so badly to be a great spiritualist, and a big part of him felt like this was going to be his first step in achieving that. He was scared, certainly, but also kind of excited. As far as he knew, nobody had been in that tower, ever, and the thought of being the first made him feel special. Destined, even. He opened the double doors and stepped into the sunlight. The entire magic school campus was a sight to behold. Everything was bright colors, shades of pink and blue and yellow. Nothing was austere or merely functional. Dotting the sandy soil were a few flowers and grasses that had survived being trodden on for years. New and old trees on thin brown stalks, with their beautiful blue leaves manicured perfectly, as well as statues to Gabned, or other art pieces. And standing above it all was the tower. Looking up at it now, in this new context, it seemed brand new. No longer just a fixture of the campus, but something alive. Something looming. Powerful. Great. The shimmering crystalline metal reflected the sun and the sky like nothing else he had ever seen. No crystal ornament or chandelier could come close. He wanted, needed to know what was inside. Looking up as he was, he almost tripped on a little Skuru boy that was quietly sniffling on the step. The Skuru were a nomadic race that could fly, or maybe just glide. Chesney wasn't quite sure. This boy had some tiny wings on his back which didn't look like they were capable of either yet, thin pointed ears, and blue hair. Thinking back, he was sure he was a recent student arrival. Chesney knelt down by the boy and asked in a quiet voice,
"What's the matter? What's your name? Are you okay?"
The boy sniffled again and looked up. He seemed much younger, maybe 7 or 8 years old.
I'm Gig. I want to go home, back to Jerain. I miss my family, and I hate studying."
Chesney thought back to his first few weeks at the magic school and felt he understood the boy's feelings. It was rough being away from home for the first time and feeling alone. It wasn't until Tail and he had become friends that his feelings of loneliness started to go away.
"Well, Gig guy, I'm Chesney."
Gig's face changed from sad to surprised.
"Oh, you're that one kid that can use fire, right?"
Chesney chuckled to himself and shook his head ruefully.
"Yeah, so they keep telling me, Gig, like."
The boy's expression changed to something like determination, and he said,
"Chesney, could you talk to the headmaster and ask him to send me home? I'm too scared to ask myself."
There was a pause while Chesney decided how to respond. He didn't think being sent home was particularly likely, but he wanted to help the boy's mood somehow. Finally, he felt he knew how to respond to the boy's request.
"Tell you what, Gig good. I think you should give it another week or 2 before you give up. The trick is, once you make a few friends, you'll be a lot less lonely."
The boy sniffed again, but then nodded a little sadly.
"Sometimes I find it hard to talk to the other kids." "Well, if you need an icebreaker, you can tell them you're my friend, and I showed you this,"
Chesney said, standing up, and then looking around. Technically, he wasn't supposed to do this sort of thing out in the open, but, hey, nobody was around. He closed his eyes and focused his mind. Inside, he felt around for that familiar feeling in his mind. There was a warm part of him, deep in his mind, almost like a candle. It was hard to reach sometimes. The trick was that he had to almost think around it. When he tried to grab right for it in his thoughts, it's like it would disappear. It was almost like something he could only see in the corner of his eye. Reaching now for that warmth, that power, he reached out his hand to the air and sent the power out from himself. With a bright flash, a burst of flames erupted from his hand and dissipated safely into the air in front of them. Immediately Gig jumped up, all sadness gone from his face, and he looked so excited.
"That's so cool, Chesney. Can you teach me how to do that?"
Chesney laughed, and said,
"I wish I could, Gig guide, but I barely know how to use it myself, let alone teach it to anyone. But you're going to learn how to do stuff just like it with whatever spirit you have an innate connection with. So, when you can, I want you to show me, okay?" "You got it, Chesney. Wow, I'm friends with the Fire Kid,"
Gig said, smiling.
"You bet, Gig."
Chesney began, kneeling down to Gig's level again.
"And if you still want to go in a few weeks, I'll go with you to talk to the headmaster, okay?"
Gig nodded and smiled.
"Thanks, Chesney. You're so cool. Thanks."
Then he gave Chesney a big hug. It felt he needed it, so Chesney held on for as long as the boy needed.
"Oh, I gotta go tell everyone you did the fire thing. It was all whoosh."
And then he was off, running to tell his classmates. Chesney smiled after him, and then wobbled a bit and sat down on the steps. It had taken a little bit out of him to do the demonstration. A spiritualist can call upon the spirits to do amazing things, but there is a cost. Your own life? If he kept using magic, he would get weaker and weaker until he either passed out from exhaustion or flat out died. But if he paced himself and made sure to rest, by the next day he usually felt completely fine. The school nurse, Liliette, had made sure to drill into everyone that in an emergency, they could also take the special fast-acting medicine that could quickly revitalize them if they had used too much magic. It was a serious thing, especially for children, to use magic, which was why it was forbidden to use it outside some kind of supervision. After a short rest he felt better, so he set off again for the tower, being careful to walk in some of the less frequented paths so he wouldn't be seen. He made his way to where the locked door at the foot of the tower stood. The locked door that every single one of his classmates had, at one time or another, secretly come and tried to open when no one was looking, and it had failed to budge even the tiniest bit each time. But now, it was open, with Duke standing beside it with his arms crossed, waiting. Chesney expected some kind of snide remark or teasing, but Duke merely asked,
"Are you finally ready to go inside?"
He wanted to just say yes and walk right in, but standing there before the door that would never open was suddenly daunting. It just felt so odd, so off-putting to see it open like that. He looked at the tower again. This was it, the point of no return. He would either turn back and tell someone, or he would walk in straight to the top. There was no middle ground, no in-between. But he knew the answer. He had to know. He would know, and he would be the first.
"Let's go,"
he said. They nodded to each other and walked through the door, which closed silently behind them.